A woman stepped off a stagecoach into a town full of strangers who all wanted the same thing: to watch her run. She had traveled 9 days through mud, cold, and doubt to marry a man she had never met. A man the entire town called a monster. A man who had written in his marriage advertisement, "I will not lie to you about what I am." Most women threw that letter away. Evelyn Mercer kept it. What happened next didn't just change 2 lives. It cracked a whole town wide open and forced every single person in it to look at themselves in the mirror. Hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let's find out how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The advertisement arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a notice about a lost mule and a listing for farmland in Ohio. Most of the women at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house in Philadelphia had already sorted through the week's batch of marriage notices from out west. They passed them around like playing cards, reading the good ones aloud and laughing at the rest, their voices sharp and bright in the dim common room where the coal fire barely kept the October cold from seeping through the walls. "Listen to this one," said Ruth, a young woman with red hair and a laugh like a hiccup. She held the paper up toward the lamp. "Wanted, a wife of decent character and strong constitution. I am a blacksmith by trade. I own land and a house that needs work. I provide for myself and could provide for a family. I will not lie to you about what I am. My face was badly burned in a fire 6 years ago. Half of it is scarred. I do not expect beauty in return because I cannot offer it myself. What I offer is respect, honest labor, and a quiet life. If that is enough for you, write to Gideon Hawthorne, Iron Ridge, Wyoming Territory." Ruth lowered the paper and looked around the room. "Well, at least he's honest." The other women murmured. Some shook their heads. One said she'd rather go hungry than marry a man who looked like that. Another said she felt sorry for him. A third said nothing at all and reached for her knitting. Evelyn Mercer sat in the corner near the window, a piece of hem she'd been reattaching still in her hands, and said nothing either. But she didn't reach for her knitting. She was thinking about the letter. Specifically, she was thinking about one sentence in it. "I will not lie to you about what I am." She had been married once before, for 6 years, to a man named Thomas Mercer, who had been handsome and charming and who had lied to her about almost everything: his debts, his habits, his other interests, the money he borrowed from her father that never came back. Thomas had died of a fever 3 years ago, and she had buried him with less grief than she expected, and more guilt about the lack of grief than she ever talked about. Since then, she had been doing piecework for a seamstress on Walnut Street, taking in hems and mending, sleeping in a shared room at Mrs. Calloway's, eating meals she could barely afford, watching the money she made disappear into rent and coal, and the bread that kept her alive for another week. She was 35 years old. She was tired. Not the tired that sleep fixes, the other kind. She thought about the blacksmith in Wyoming. She thought about that sentence. She asked Ruth if she could keep the paper when everyone was done with it, and Ruth shrugged and said, "Sure, nobody's going to be answering that one." Evelyn wrote to Gideon Hawthorne on a Thursday. She sat at the small writing desk in the corner of the room she shared with 2 other women, both of whom were already asleep, and she wrote 3 drafts before she settled on one. The first was too formal. The second was too desperate. The third was just honest. She told him her age. She told him she was a widow. She told him she could sew and cook and manage a household on very little, and that she was not delicate and did not intend to be. She told him she had read his advertisement twice and that she respected a man who didn't make promises he couldn't keep. She did not mention what her husband had been like. She did not mention that she had almost no money. She did not mention that she was afraid. She folded the letter, addressed it, and mailed it before she could change her mind. His reply came 3 weeks later. It was short, 2 paragraphs written in a careful, slightly cramped hand that looked like a man who had taught himself to write and never quite trusted it. "Miss Mercer, I was not sure anyone would answer. I appreciate that you were direct. I want to be equally direct with you. The scars are worse than the advertisement makes them sound. I say this not to discourage you, but because I believe you deserve to know. I have been told they are difficult to look at. I have seen people cross the street to avoid my face. I mention this not for sympathy, but because if you come here and find yourself unable to bear it, I don't want you to feel trapped. I'd rather know before than after. That said, if you are still willing, I am willing. The house has a good kitchen. The town has a church and a doctor and a school if children become part of it. Winter comes hard and early out here. I'd need you before December if you can manage it. Yours respectfully, Gideon Hawthorne. Evelyn read it twice. She read the part about people crossing the street to avoid his face, and she felt something complicated move through her. Not pity exactly, something more uncomfortable than that, something that felt like recognition. She wrote back the same day, Mr. Hawthorne, I'm still willing. I'll be there by the 1st of November. The stagecoach pulled into Iron Ridge on a gray afternoon when the sky looked like dirty wool and the wind had teeth. Evelyn had been traveling for 9 days. She smelled like road dust and old wool and the particular exhaustion of a person who has slept sitting up too many times in a row. Her trunk was in the luggage boot. She had exactly $11.30 left to her name. She pressed her face to the window as the coach slowed and looked out at the town. Iron Ridge was not impressive. It was a main street of maybe a dozen buildings, a general store, a saloon, a feed store, a small church at the far end, a livery stable, and a scattering of wood-frame businesses in between. The street was unpaved and rutted with wagon tracks. A couple of horses stood tied at the rail outside the saloon. A dog lay in the middle of the road and didn't bother to move for the coach. But there were people. That surprised her. Not just a few. What looked like half the town had gathered along the boardwalk on both sides of the street, and as the coach slowed to a stop, she realized with a cold jolt to her stomach that they were there to watch her arrive. She understood immediately. In a town this small, a mail-order bride coming to marry Gideon Hawthorne wasn't just local news. It was the only news. She could see it in the way they stood, not casual, not going about business. They were positioned, waiting. Some of the faces were merely curious. Some were already smiling in a way she didn't like. She straightened her back and reached for her bag. The coach door opened. The driver offered his hand. She took it, stepped down, and stood in the street. The watching was immediate and total. She felt it like pressure. All those eyes, the murmur that ran through the gathered crowd, the way a few people near the front leaned toward each other and whispered without taking their gaze off her. She kept her chin level. She had spent 6 years married to a man who made her feel small in front of other people. She was done shrinking. She looked for Gideon Hawthorne. He wasn't hard to find. He was standing about 30 feet away, to the left of the coach stop, slightly apart from the crowd. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders built from years at the forge, wearing a clean work shirt and dark trousers, and holding his hat in his hands like a man waiting for bad news he's already accepted. His hair was dark and going gray at the temples. He was 39 years old, and he looked it in the way that men who work hard outdoors look their age honestly. And his face. She looked at his face. The burns covered the entire left side. From just above his hairline, across his cheekbone and jaw, down the left side of his neck and below the collar of his shirt. The skin there was tight and different, layered in the way that healed burns layer, pulling slightly at the corner of his left eye and the edge of his mouth. It changed the geometry of his face, made it uneven in a way that the eye kept trying to resolve and couldn't quite. She could see why it unsettled people. It was the kind of thing that human instinct flinched from. She felt it herself, that tiny involuntary flinch, and she noted it and let it pass. She walked toward him. The murmur in the crowd changed pitch. She heard someone say something low that she couldn't make out, and then a short laugh, quickly quieted. She didn't turn to look. She kept walking. Gideon watched her come. He did not move toward her. His jaw was set. His right eye, the undamaged one, was steady and very dark, and she couldn't tell what was in it yet, only that he was braced for something, the way a man braces when he's certain the blow is coming and has decided he's going to take it standing up. She stopped in front of him. Up close, the scarring was more detailed than it had been from 30 feet. She could see the texture of it, the way it caught the flat November light. She looked at it without looking away, not because she was forcing herself, but because she'd made a decision somewhere between the coach window and this moment that she was going to look at this man fully or not at all. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said. "Miss Mercer." His voice was lower than she'd expected, not unfriendly, careful. "You came. I said I would. People say a lot of things." He seemed to catch himself saying it, and his mouth tightened slightly. "I'm sorry. That wasn't... It's fine." She glanced briefly at the crowd, still watching, still murmuring. "Are we going to stand here and be looked at? or is there somewhere we can go?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but some of the bracing went out of him. "There's a wagon. I'll get your trunk." "I can help." "I imagine you can." He paused. "But you don't have to today." She let him get the trunk. She stood in the street and let the town look at her, and she looked right back at them, meeting eyes until they slid away. An older woman near the front of the gathered crowd, heavy-set, with a hat trimmed in faded ribbon, kept her gaze longest. And there was something in her face that wasn't mockery, more like assessment, like she was waiting to see what Evelyn Mercer was actually made of. Evelyn didn't look away first. The house sat about a quarter-mile from the main street, down a dirt track that ran alongside the smithy. Gideon drove the wagon in silence, the kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable yet, because two people haven't had enough time together to know the difference between comfortable quiet and the other kind. The smithy was dark and cold now, its big doors shut, but she could smell iron and old smoke and hot metal somehow even from here, the way certain smells live in wood. The house itself was small, a single-story structure with a covered porch, 2 windows facing the front, a chimney that looked solidly built. The clapboard needed paint. There was a kitchen garden on the south side that was dead and brown for the season, but had obviously been more than just weeds in better weather. She could see the stakes still standing, the dried remnants of beans and what might have been squash. "It needs work," Gideon said, looking at it with the flat assessment of a man who sees what it is rather than what he wishes it was. "I warned you it needed work." "You did." She looked at it. She thought about the room she'd been sleeping in at Mrs. Calloway's, the cracked plaster ceiling, the window that wouldn't quite close, the sound of Ruth snoring 3 feet away. "It's bigger than what I left behind." He looked at her then, quickly, like he wasn't sure if she was making fun of him and needed to check her face to know she wasn't. He seemed to decide that. Inside the house was cleaner than she'd expected. He'd clearly scrubbed the place before she arrived, recently enough that she could smell the lye soap. The furniture was sparse, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, a cook stove that was newer than everything else in the room, a rocking chair near the single window. There was a bedroom off the main room and a small second room that held stored supplies and an extra cot. Everything was functional and nothing was pretty, in the way of a man who had never had anyone to make things pretty for and had stopped imagining it. "I thought you could have the bedroom," he said, stopping in the doorway and not quite coming inside the house yet. "I've been sleeping on the cot in the back room. I'll keep doing that for now, until you're settled." He said the last word with a small hesitation, and she understood what he was navigating, the particular awkwardness of 2 strangers who had agreed to be married but hadn't yet figured out what that meant on a Tuesday afternoon with 9 days of road dust still on her coat. "That's fine," she said. Thank you." He nodded. He set her trunk down just inside the door. He was about to leave when she said, "Have you eaten?" He stopped. "Not since morning." "Is there food in the house?" "Some. I picked up supplies yesterday. Flour, salt pork, coffee, some cornmeal. There's potatoes in the root cellar." "Then go do whatever you need to do," she said. "Come back in an hour. I'll have something on." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to do that tonight." "I know I don't have to." She was already unpinning her coat. "I want to. It'll give me something to do with my hands." He stood in the doorway a moment longer, his hat back in his hands, the scarred side of his face turned slightly away in an angle she'd already noticed. A habit, probably so old he didn't know he was doing it anymore. Like people with crooked teeth who learn to smile a certain way. "The coffee's in the tin on the shelf," he said finally. "The good pot's the one with the red handle. The other one leaks." "All right." He left. She stood alone in the small house that was now, in some sense, hers, and put her hands flat on the surface of the table for a moment, the solid realness of it, the wood under her palms, and breathed. Then she took off her coat, hung it on the nail by the door, and went to find the tin with the coffee. They were not immediately comfortable together. That would be too easy and too false a thing to say. What they were was careful. 2 people trying not to startle each other, trying to take up exactly the right amount of space, learning the rhythms of living in proximity to a stranger. Gideon left for the smithy before dawn every morning. She could hear him, the quiet sounds of him moving through the back room, the creak of the door, the sound of footsteps on the porch. Sometimes she was awake for it, and sometimes she wasn't. He came back at midday for the meal she left covered on the stove, ate it alone when she was busy with other things, and came back again at dusk for supper. He was scrupulously considerate in small ways. He fixed the hinge on the kitchen cabinet that she'd mentioned, offhandedly, was stiff. He brought in wood without being asked. He didn't take up more space in the house than necessary, moving through the rooms with a slight compression to him, a habit of making himself smaller that didn't match his actual size. She began to see the edges of him. Not the whole picture, that takes longer than a few weeks, but the shape. He was quiet, but not the quiet of a man who had nothing to say. More the quiet of a man who had learned that what he said didn't much matter to most people and had adjusted accordingly. When he did say something, it was direct and meant. He didn't waste words. He didn't complain. He worked with the kind of sustained, focused effort that she recognized as the mark of a person who had long ago made peace with labor as a companion rather than a burden. She also saw that he was lonely in a specific way, the kind that comes not from lack of people nearby, but from years of being excluded from the ordinary warmth of community. He had lived in this town for 12 years, she learned gradually, and in that time had managed to be both essential and invisible. Everyone brought him their metalwork, their hinges and tools and horseshoes and wagon parts, because he was the best blacksmith in 50 miles, and they all knew it. And then they left. Nobody lingered. Nobody came to talk. Nobody brought him a pie. She started to understand the weight of that. Not all at once. She wasn't the kind of person who understood things all at once. But gradually, in the way you come to understand a room after you've lived in it long enough that you stop noticing the furniture and start noticing the light. She also began to understand that he expected her to leave. Not explicitly. He never said it. But it was there in the way he didn't quite let himself relax around her. The way he kept a kind of careful emotional distance. Like a man who has almost convinced himself that the thing in front of him isn't real, so that when it disappears, it won't hurt as much. Every time she did something that suggested permanence, hanging her things in the bedroom, planting bulbs in the kitchen garden for spring, mending the curtain in the front window, she could see him noticing it, and something in his face would do a complicated thing that she couldn't fully name. She didn't talk about it yet. There wasn't language for it yet, but she filed it away. The town, meanwhile, was doing what small towns do, watching, judging, and making sure the object of their scrutiny knew it. She encountered this most acutely on her second Sunday, when she went to the church at the end of the main street. Gideon didn't go. He never went. She had already learned this without asking, just from the fact that he worked on Sundays like any other day and never mentioned it. She went alone, which she understood was fine. The church was small and cold and smelled of candle wax and old wood. The congregation was maybe 40 people. When she walked in and chose a pew in the middle section, she felt the room's attention shift to her the way a lake surface shifts when something lands on it. She sat down, folded her hands, and looked at the front of the church. The woman next to her, after a long deliberate pause, shifted slightly away. After the service, in the small gathering on the church steps that everyone seemed to participate in, a woman named Margaret Birch, wife of the town's general store owner, a position that apparently conferred a certain social authority, made her way to Evelyn with the fixed purposefulness of a person who has decided to be kind in a way that isn't entirely kind. "Mrs. Hawthorne," she said. She was somewhere in her 50s with a sharp, pleasant face and careful eyes. "I'm Margaret Birch. I wanted to introduce myself. We were all very—" A small pause. Surprised when we heard Gideon had actually found someone willing. "I'm sure," Evelyn said. "He's not— that is, he's been here a long time. Everyone knows Gideon. Well." Margaret seemed to run out of words that were simultaneously honest and polite, and settled for a smile. "How are you finding it? Iron Ridge, I mean. It must be very different from Philadelphia." "It's quieter," Evelyn said. "I like quiet." "Yes, I imagine you'd need to." Another small pause. "If you ever need anything, you know. If things are difficult, if you find you need—" She stopped again, and this time Evelyn finished the sentence for her. "If I need to leave—" Margaret blinked. "I was going to say if you need someone to talk to." "Thank you," Evelyn said pleasantly. "I'll keep that in mind." She walked home. The wind had picked up and it was properly cold now, the Wyoming cold that carries ice even when there's no snow yet, and she walked with her coat pulled tight and thought about the careful way Margaret Birch had said Gideon's name. Not unkindly, almost pityingly, like a problem that had never been solved. She thought about the town's certainty, the absolute bedrock certainty of it, that she would eventually decide this had been a mistake. She could feel it in every interaction she had, even the friendly ones. They were all waiting for her to admit what they already knew. She thought about Gideon, alone at the forge on a Sunday morning, working iron by himself in the cold. She walked faster. Lucy Hale appeared on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. Evelyn was inside, sorting through the basket of mending she'd taken on from one of the farms out on the East Road, an extra source of money she'd arranged without telling Gideon first, and which he'd accepted without comment when he found out, only asking once if she was sure she wasn't taking on too much. She wasn't. Sewing was something she knew how to do without thinking, which was its own kind of rest. She heard a sound from the direction of the smithy. Not the usual sounds of hammer and iron, but a child's voice. Then silence. Then the voice again. She set down the mending and went to the window. There was a girl standing near the open side door of the smithy, small and dark-haired, maybe 8 or 9 years old, in a coat that was slightly too big for her and boots that were slightly too small. She was standing at the threshold of the smithy with her hands clasped behind her back, looking at something inside with the focused attention of a child who has found something genuinely interesting. Evelyn couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see from her angle at the window that Gideon had paused his work. He was standing at the anvil with the hammer in his hand, and he was talking to the girl. His body language was uncertain. The same slight compression she'd noticed in him before, the same brace for impact. Like he expected at any moment that the girl would suddenly remember she was supposed to be afraid of him. The girl stepped forward into the smithy. Gideon stood very still. The girl pointed at something, the bellows, Evelyn thought, and said something, and after a moment Gideon answered, and the girl asked something else. And he answered again, and then, gradually, carefully, like a man diffusing something he doesn't understand, he went back to work. And the girl stood nearby and watched, asking questions in the candid, relentless way of children who haven't learned yet to moderate their curiosity for other people's comfort. Evelyn stood at the window for a while and watched this. Later, when the girl had gone and Gideon came in for supper, she said, "Who's the girl who came to the smithy?" He sat down at the table. He did the thing he sometimes did, considered the question like it might have more angles than it appeared to, before answering it. Lucy Hale. She lives with the Prentice family out on the Birch Road. She's an orphan. Prentice took her in. He paused. She's been coming around for about 3 weeks. I kept expecting her to stop. Why would she stop? He looked at her. Because of... He made a gesture that indicated his face without touching it. She didn't seem bothered, Evelyn said. She's 8. She doesn't know yet. Know what? He was quiet for a moment. That she's supposed to be. Evelyn considered this. She wanted to say something about it, several things, actually, but she could see that he was already expecting her to, and that what he was braced for was her sympathy, which would feel to him like pity, which was the thing he was least able to receive. So she said instead, "What does she ask about?" He looked up, and she caught him slightly off guard. "What?" "When she's in the smithy, what does she ask about?" Something in his face shifted. "Everything," he said, and there was something almost rueful in it. Not quite a laugh, but the shadow of one. "How hot does the fire get? What different kinds of metal look like when they're ready? Why you hid it in some places and not others? How long it took to learn?" He paused. "She asked me once if it hurt when I got burned." "What did you say?" I said yes. "What did she say?" She said, "But you're okay now, right?" Like that was the important part. The after. He was quiet a moment. Then she asked if I could show her how to use the bellows. Evelyn didn't say anything. She reached for her fork. "I showed her," he said. "She's surprisingly strong for her size." "She looks like she's got some grit to her," Evelyn agreed. He nodded, then, after a pause, "She's going to come back tomorrow. She said so." "All right. I don't know if..." He stopped. "She can come back," Evelyn said. "If she wants to come, let her come." He looked at her across the table in the yellow lamplight, and she could see him trying to work out what to do with that, the simple, uncomplicated permission of it, which he clearly wasn't accustomed to. "All right," he said finally. She passed him the bread. December arrived and brought the cold it promised. Gideon had warned her, but warning doesn't fully prepare a person from Philadelphia for Wyoming winter. The particular texture of it, how it isn't just cold, but a kind of cold that has permanence to it, that settles in like it owns the place, because it does. She learned to sleep with an extra blanket and to keep the stove fed through the night. She learned which part of the kitchen floor was coldest and to step around it in the mornings. She learned to keep a brick warming near the stove to take to bed, which was a thing she'd only read about in books before. Gideon, without ceremony, moved the stack of extra wood closer to the kitchen door so she didn't have to go as far in the cold. He did this while she was at church and didn't mention it. She didn't mention it either. They were learning each other's edges in the way you learn a room in the dark. Carefully, one step at a time, trying not to hit anything by accident. She had told him once, in the third week, that she had been a seamstress for 7 years. He'd nodded and said, "Is that what you want to keep doing?" And she'd been caught off guard by the question, which presumed she might have a preference about it. "It's what I'm good at," she said. "That's not the same thing as wanting to." She'd looked at him. "No, it's not." She'd thought about it. "I think I want to have a garden. A proper one. I want to grow things." He'd nodded again, seriously, like she'd said something of weight. 2 days later, he came back from town with a small packet of seed catalogs from the general store, dropped them on the table without explanation, and went back to the smithy. She sat with the catalogs all evening, reading about things that would grow in Wyoming soil, and felt something strange and gentle happen in her chest that took her a while to identify as happiness or something close to it. She also began to understand his silences better. There were the comfortable silences, which she was getting used to. And there were the other ones, the silences around certain topics, certain windows in time, certain questions she didn't ask because she could feel the weight behind them. She learned, piece by piece, from things he let drop and things the town told her without meaning to, the story of the fire. It had happened 6 years ago, in the early morning, when a barn on the outskirts of town had gone up in the night. The barn had belonged to a family named Alcott. The father was sick, the wife was pregnant, there were animals. By the time anyone knew the barn was burning, the animals were trapped inside. Gideon had gone in. He'd gotten out 3 horses and a pair of mules. The roof had begun to go by then, and anyone with sense had backed off. He'd gone back in for a pair of goats that were screaming in the back. He'd gotten the goats. He'd gotten out just before the roof came down. The burns on his face, his neck, his left shoulder and arm were the result of those last 2 minutes. She learned this not from him, but from Jacob Prentice, Lucy's guardian, who told it matter-of-factly one afternoon when he came to the smithy to pick up Lucy and stayed to talk. "Town's never quite known what to do with Gideon," Jacob said, not unkindly. "He did a brave thing, and then they had to look at the evidence of it every time they saw him, and I think it made people feel a certain way about themselves. Easier to avoid him than to sit with that." Evelyn thought about this for a long time. She thought about it that evening when Gideon came in for supper and moved around the kitchen with the particular care of a man who doesn't expect to be welcome in his own house. She thought about it while she watched him eat without hurrying, because he never hurried at meals. One of the small dignities he allowed himself in private that he clearly didn't expect from the world outside. She thought about saying something, about the fire, about what she knew, about what she thought. She didn't. Not yet. There would be time. And some things needed to be approached from the right angle, or they collapsed. But she began quietly and without announcement to think about what it meant to be Gideon Hawthorne in a town like Iron Ridge. What it cost. What it had cost every day for 6 years. The accumulated weight of all those sideways looks and crossed streets and careful avoidances pressed down on a man who had done something brave and been rewarded with isolation. She began to understand, in the marrow of it, why he hadn't believed anyone would answer his advertisement. And she began also quietly and without announcement to be angry about it. Christmas came and went without ceremony. She made a proper meal of it, a roasted chicken that had been a project since she'd spent some of the mending money on a good bird from the Prentice farm. And they sat at the table and ate it, and she put a pine bough on the windowsill because she wanted something green. Gideon gave her a small, useful gift, a pair of good leather work gloves, because he had noticed she was wearing a pair with a hole in the left thumb that she hadn't gotten around to replacing. She gave him a scarf she'd knitted, dark blue wool, which she'd been working on in secret for 3 weeks. He held the scarf for a moment, then he wrapped it around his neck, over the high collar of his shirt, that she'd understood was also a habit, not vanity, but a way of covering the scarring on his neck in public. The blue wool sat against his jaw and he reached up and touched it once, lightly, with 2 fingers. He said, "Thank you, Evelyn." And the way he said her name, the first time he'd used it, she realized, without the formal prefix, was quiet and careful and meant in a way that made her look at the window. "It gets cold," she said to say something. "You need something around your neck." "I do," he agreed. They sat with their coffee after the meal, and she asked him, because she'd been thinking about how to ask it for a week, "Gideon, what happened before the fire? What was it like here?" He was quiet for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a thing he did when he was thinking, she'd noticed. "It was fine," he said, and then, recognizing that this wasn't enough. "I had people I talked to, not friends exactly, but the way men know each other in a town. You nod at them. You know what they're working on. You help when you need to help each other." And after, the nodding stopped. He said it flatly, like a man reporting weather. "Not all at once. Gradually. Like, the first few weeks, people were decent. People came and said things people say. Then they stopped coming. And then I'd see them in town, and it was the eyes." He stopped. "The eyes?" "The way people look at you when they know they're supposed to feel something, and they don't want to feel it, and so they look somewhere else. You start to compensate. You learn the angles. Which side of the street has fewer people? What time to go to the general store when Birch won't have too many customers in? You get very good at being invisible in a place where everyone knows your name." He picked up his coffee. "It's a particular skill." She was quiet. "I'm not telling you this to—" He stopped. "I don't want you to feel sorry for me." "I don't feel sorry for you," she said. He looked at her. "I feel angry," she said. "That's different." He was very still for a moment, like the difference between waiting for impact and having the impact not come. "That's—" he started and then didn't finish. "You went into a burning barn," she said, "twice. You saved those animals. And then the town decided that what they'd rather do was pretend you weren't there, because looking at what your face cost you made them feel something uncomfortable. And you let them do it." She said this last sentence not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, which she meant it to be. He looked at her for a long moment. "What was I supposed to do?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I don't think it should have been that." He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. And something in the room between them was different after that. Not fixed, nothing so simple as that, but altered, like a window that's been opened. Outside, the December wind found the eaves of the house and rattled them, and the lamp on the table threw their shadows long across the wall, and Gideon Hawthorne sat with his coffee and the blue wool scarf around his neck and looked at his wife, who had come from 9 days away to sit across from him and call it anger instead of pity. He thought he had never understood the difference between the two things as clearly as he did in that moment. January was the hardest month. The cold locked the ground and piled snow against the cabin walls and kept most people indoors and close. But Lucy still came to the smithy. Not every day now, the cold made that impractical, but 2 or 3 times a week when the weather permitted, arriving in her slightly too big coat and her slightly too small boots with fresh questions and an absolute lack of the anxiety around Gideon that every other member of Iron Ridge seemed to carry as a permanent condition. "She asked me today what I was making," Gideon reported one evening, with the tone of a man who has almost but not quite learned to let himself find something amusing. "I told her it was a hinge for the Alcott barn door. She asked me why I was making something for people when people weren't very nice to me." Evelyn looked up from her mending. "What did you say?" "I said that's not how it works. You make what you're asked to make. You do the job. What people think of you is separate." What did she say to that? She thought about it for a while, and then she said, "That sounds lonely." He said this quietly. "She's 8 years old." Evelyn watched him. "She's right. I know she is." He looked at his hands, the forge-calloused knuckles, the dark edge of old burn scars on his left forearm that continued up under his sleeve. "I've been doing it long enough that I forget to think of it that way." "What way?" "Lonely." He said the word like he was testing the weight of it after a long time of not using it. "I think I stopped calling it that. I just called it Regular, the way things were. The lamp threw its yellow circle over the table between them. Outside, the wind was talking to itself in the eaves. "It doesn't have to stay the way it was," Evelyn said. He looked at her. She looked back. It wasn't a comfortable moment. It was the other kind, the kind where you're saying the thing and the person you're saying it to isn't sure yet if they believe it. And you're not sure either, but you say it anyway because not saying it is worse. "No," he said finally. "I suppose it doesn't." He was quiet a moment, and then he said something she hadn't expected. "Evelyn, do you regret coming here?" She considered the question the way it deserved to be considered, not dismissively, not rushing to reassure. "Some mornings when the cold gets in through that gap in the bedroom window, I think about central Philadelphia and the fact that there were 3 bakeries within walking distance, and I don't feel great about Wyoming in general." She paused. "But that's not the same as regret." "No, I don't regret it." He nodded slowly, like a man filing something away in a place he'll be able to find it later. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you regret the advertisement?" He was very quiet. "No," he said. "I'm surprised I don't. I was expecting to. I thought you'd—" He stopped. "I thought I'd be watching every day for you to start looking at the door." "I'm not looking at the door." "No." He looked at her steadily with his dark right eye, the good side and the scarred side both forward now, the way he almost never turned his face in public. "No, you're not." Something settled between them like a foundation stone being laid. Not romance exactly, not yet, but something more durable than that. The early architecture of trust, the sense that two people who had both been separately wrong about the world might be building something right together without quite knowing what it was yet, or being in a hurry to name it. The fire in the stove snapped and settled. The January wind kept going. They sat together in the small house on the edge of Iron Ridge, and neither of them looked at the door. February came in sideways, the way it does in Wyoming. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, like a door kicked open. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees below what January had already established as brutal, and the snow that had been politely accumulating along the fence lines and cabin walls decided to get serious. Gideon spent 3 days reinforcing the smithy roof, working in the cold with his breath coming out in hard white clouds, and Evelyn spent those same 3 days doing what she'd learned to do when the weather locked her inside. She worked, mending, sewing, reorganizing the pantry, making lists of seeds she wanted to order come spring, practical things, things with outcomes she could see. It was during those 3 days that she noticed something she hadn't quite named before. The house felt different when Gideon was nearby, but outside compared to when he was entirely gone. When he was inside, the house had a kind of settled weight to it. 2 people in a space, the small sounds of coexistence. When he was working just outside, in the smithy, she could hear the occasional sound of it through the walls. Hammer on metal, the creak of something being moved. And that sound was its own kind of company. But when he was in town, picking up supplies or delivering an order, the house went very quiet in a way that she'd stopped preferring. She didn't examine that too closely. She had learned from her first marriage the danger of examining things too closely too soon, of naming things before they were ready to hold a name. She just noticed it and kept making her seed lists. The hard weather broke in the second week of February, and Iron Ridge exhaled. People came out of their houses and back into the streets, and the general store did the business of a week in a single morning as half the town restocked whatever had run low during the freeze. Evelyn went on a Tuesday, with her list and her carefully counted coins, and ran into Margaret Birch near the flour. Margaret was friendlier now than she'd been in November. Not dramatically, not in a way that required acknowledgement, but in the way that people soften when someone they expected to fold has simply stayed put. The mere fact of Evelyn still being there, still walking around Iron Ridge, still married to Gideon Hawthorne, and apparently not destroyed by the experience, had shifted something in Margaret's calculations. She asked after Evelyn's health, asked whether the cabin roof had held through the hard freeze, asked with what sounded like genuine curiosity whether Evelyn had taken on more sewing work. Some, Evelyn said, measuring out her flour. Enough to keep busy. There might be more if you want it, Margaret said. Helen Voss has been looking for someone to do alterations. Her dressmaker in Cheyenne moved away last fall. I'd be interested. Tell her to come by. Margaret nodded. Then she said, in a slightly different tone, the tone of someone approaching the actual thing they wanted to say, Gideon's been busy this winter? Always busy, Evelyn said. He does good work, Margaret said, and she said it with the particular emphasis of someone who wants credit for saying the right thing. Everyone knows that. We all appreciate his work. Evelyn looked at her. He knows, she said, keeping her voice even. He also knows the difference between being appreciated for your labor and being welcomed as a neighbor. But I'm sure you know that too. Margaret's mouth tightened slightly. Not offended exactly. She had the kind of social intelligence that recognized when she'd been accurately assessed. I suppose we haven't been as... No, Evelyn said. You haven't. She put the flower in her basket. But that's something that can change, starting with whoever decides to change it first. She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way she said most things, straightforwardly, without dramatics. Margaret stood with her own basket and looked at Evelyn for a long moment, and Evelyn looked back. And then Margaret said, Henry's been meaning to bring his gate hinge in. It's been broken since October. The smithy's open, Evelyn said, every day. She paid for her flower and left. She didn't tell Gideon about the conversation. He would have found it either patronizing or embarrassing, and she didn't want to hand him either. But 2 days later, Henry Birch came to the smithy with his gate hinge, and he stayed 20 minutes longer than the transaction required. And when he left, he said, Good work as always, Gideon. And the word always in there, with its acknowledgement of continuity, of a history that included more than just metal and coin, was small, but it was there. Gideon didn't mention it at supper, but he seemed fractionally less compressed than usual. These were not large things. Evelyn had stopped expecting large things, from the town or from Gideon or from herself. Small things were what daily life was made of, and she was made for daily life. What she had not been prepared for, what came in the cold tail end of that February and caught her before she'd arranged herself for it, was the conversation about the fire. She had known the broad facts of it since December. What she hadn't known, because Gideon hadn't told her and she hadn't pushed, was what it had cost him in ways beyond the visible. She found out the way she'd found out most things about him. Gradually, sideways, through the space that opens up in the evening after supper when the lamps are lit and the day is done, and the particular tiredness of having worked hard makes certain things easier to say than they are in full daylight. He was cleaning the soot from his forearms at the basin the way he always did before sitting down to eat, and she was at the stove with her back to him, and he said, not leading up to it, Do you ever wonder why I put that advertisement in the paper, the specific one I wrote? She stirred the pot. I've thought about it. Most men writing those advertisements, they try to sell themselves. Best foot forward. Leave the worst parts for later. He dried his hands. I couldn't make myself do that. Why? He came to the table and sat down. She heard the chair, the small sounds of him settling. Because I'd tried it. Not with a marriage notice. Just in general. For the first year after the fire, I tried to be what I'd been before. Same way, same approach. I tried to pretend the way people looked at me didn't change anything. That if I just kept going, it would get normal. He paused. It didn't get normal. She turned from the stove and brought the pot to the table, ladled the stew into the bowls. She sat down across from him. What happened? Nothing dramatic. That's the thing about it. Nothing happened. The looks kept being what they were. The conversations kept ending a little faster than they should. People kept finding somewhere else to be when I came in. He looked at his bowl. After the first year, I stopped pretending. And then for a while, I tried being angry about it. That didn't work either. Anger at what? Nobody did anything wrong, technically. Nobody said anything. They just arranged themselves. That's doing something, Evelyn said. I know, but you can't fight something that won't stand up and be a thing. He picked up his spoon. Eventually, I just closed it off. The part that wanted it to be different. And I stopped hoping for anything and started doing the work and leaving the rest alone, which is fine. That works. It's sustainable. He said the word with the flat precision of someone who has had time to find the right word for it. But I was very tired by the time I wrote that advertisement. I was tired of pretending I was all right with it. She was quiet, letting him finish. So I wrote what was true, he said. I figured if I was honest about the worst of it, and someone still answered, then at least we'd start on ground that wasn't sand. He finally ate a spoonful. I didn't expect anyone to answer. I know, she said. What made you? He looked at her, and it was a real question. Not rhetorical, not performed. He genuinely wanted to know. She thought about how to answer it honestly. That sentence, she said, I will not lie to you about what I am. My first husband lied to me about almost everything. Not cruelty, exactly. He wasn't cruel on purpose, but he was very good at managing what I knew, very good at telling me the version of things that kept everything comfortable for him. She looked at her bowl. I was so tired of comfortable lies. I'd have taken a hard truth over one more comfortable lie, and there you were, offering exactly that. He was very still across the table. So I answered, she said, and here I am. Here you are, he said, quietly, like confirming something to himself. They ate for a while without talking, which was fine. Their silences had sorted themselves out by now. He knew the ones that were just quiet and the ones that were still working something through, and this one was the latter, but it was the working something through kind that didn't need interrupting. After a while he said, Thank you for telling me that. Thank you for asking, she said. Outside the wind was nothing compared to February's worst. Spring was still weeks away, but you could feel it somewhere under the cold, the slightly longer days, the sun sitting a fraction higher in the sky. The frozen ground was still frozen, but not as absolutely as it had been. Things could still change. Things were, in fact, already changing, even if you couldn't see the whole shape of it yet. Lucy came 3 times a week now through the rest of winter, and the smithy had begun to feel, to Evelyn's eye, different on the days she came versus the days she didn't. On the days Lucy came, Gideon's movements had a certain quality to them. Not quite relaxed, not the compressed, careful efficiency of his public mode, but something between. He explained things when she asked, which was constantly, and the explaining seemed to do something for him that she couldn't put a precise word to. Like he'd forgotten, somewhere in the years of making himself smaller, that he knew things worth teaching. Lucy was also, as Evelyn had assessed that first day, a child with serious grit. One afternoon in late February, Lucy came to the kitchen door instead of the smithy, which she'd never done before. She knocked twice, which was 2 more times than she usually bothered with. Evelyn opened the door and found her standing there with her hands in her pockets and a complicated expression on her face that was trying to be casual and not quite managing it. Is Mr. Gideon busy? Lucy asked. He's finishing up an order. He'll be in for supper in an hour. Evelyn stepped back from the door. Do you want to wait? Lucy came inside in the careful way of a child who'd been taught to be careful in other people's houses, looking around the kitchen with her dark eyes taking inventory. She sat in the chair Evelyn indicated and put her hands in her lap and looked at the table. Something on your mind? Evelyn said, going back to the stove. A pause. Danny Alcott said something to me at school. Evelyn kept her voice even. What did he say? He said I shouldn't come here anymore. He said... She stopped. He said the blacksmith was a freak, and anybody who went near him was stupid. She reported this in the careful flat tone of a child repeating something that hurt more than she wanted it to show. Evelyn put down the wooden spoon she'd been holding. She turned around. Lucy was looking at the table. What did you say to Danny Alcott? Evelyn asked. A small silence. Nothing. I didn't know what to say. I just came here anyway. Evelyn pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Lucy, how long have you been coming to the smithy? Since October, before you came. And in all that time, has Gideon Hawthorne ever been unkind to you? Ever said something that wasn't right? Ever given you reason to be afraid? Lucy looked up. No. He showed me how the bellows work. He let me hold the hammer once. He told me the names of different kinds of iron. She paused. He remembered I don't like beets. He told you not to put them in the soup when I was here. Evelyn didn't know that last part. She filed it away. Then you already know what to say to Danny Alcott, she said. You tell him that you decide for yourself who's worth knowing, and you've decided. Lucy looked at her steadily. What if he keeps saying things? He probably will, Evelyn said honestly. Some people keep saying things for a long time. You still get to decide whether to let it change what you do. The girl sat with that. Okay, she said finally, in the way children say okay when they've actually heard something and are putting it somewhere to look at later. They sat in the kitchen, and Evelyn gave her some bread with butter. and Lucy ate it and asked several questions about the seed catalogs that were still on the table. And by the time Gideon came in from the smithy, she had reorganized the catalogs by vegetable type and was explaining to Evelyn why she thought potatoes were more interesting than people gave them credit for. Gideon stopped in his doorway, taking in the scene. Lucy looked up and said, Mr. Gideon, did you know there's a kind of potato that's purple all the way through? I did not know that, he said. He looked at Evelyn over the top of Lucy's head. She didn't say anything. He came inside and hung up his coat. You should grow those ones, Lucy said, already turning back to the catalog. They'd be interesting. I'll take it under advisement, he said, and sat down at the table, and the kitchen was warm, and the three of them looked at pictures of purple potatoes in the lamplight. And if it didn't look like much from the outside, that was because the most important things rarely do. The week after, something shifted in the pattern of the town, small but definite. Helen Voss came to the cabin about the alterations work, as Margaret had suggested, and she stayed for tea and talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with sewing, the new school teacher who was arriving in spring, whether the mercantile would carry decent fabric this year, the state of the road east. She sat in Evelyn's kitchen and talked like a neighbor, which was what she was. When she left, she paused at the door and said, I drive past the smithy twice a week on the way to my sister's. I've seen that little Hale girl in there. She's brave, that one. She's got good sense, Evelyn said. Helen nodded. She looked at the smithy, dark now, supper time, and then back at Evelyn. He did a good thing, with the Alcott barn. I know that doesn't... She stopped and started again. I know saying so now this late isn't worth much. It's worth something, Evelyn said. Worth more than saying nothing. Helen Voss drove away. The cold evening settled over the yard. Evelyn stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the smithy, and thought about what things cost and what they were worth, and how rarely the two amounts were equal. Then she went inside. She didn't tell Gideon about that conversation either. What she told him instead that evening was that she'd ordered the purple potatoes. He looked up from his coffee. Did you? And some other things. Carrots, beans, 2 kinds of squash. She put the order form on the table. It's going to be a proper garden this year. He looked at the form. She'd written out the order in her clear, steady hand, and the list was longer than strictly necessary. He traced the edge of the paper once with one finger. Carrots are good in this soil, he said. They go deep. Don't need much once they're in. That's why I picked them. He looked at her. She looked back. The lamp between them threw its small circle of light over the table, over the order form for the spring seeds, over the two of them sitting in the house that was slowly, undramatically, in the way of real things rather than stories, becoming a home. Evelyn, he said. He stopped. He looked at the form again. He was not a man who found the right words quickly, and she had long since stopped expecting him to. I'm glad you're here, he said finally. I know I don't say that enough. I don't say most things enough. But I wanted to say it. She didn't make a production of it. She didn't look away or toward the window or do any of the things people do when they're trying to absorb something they weren't expecting. She just looked at him and said, I know. I'm glad I'm here too. Outside, February finished itself out, cold and honest. Inside, the stove held its warmth and the lamp held its circle of light. And two people who had both separately given up on something without admitting it were quietly, carefully, without ceremony, finding out they hadn't had to. March arrived and the ground began reluctantly to soften at the edges. Lucy came to the smithy on a warm afternoon and brought a girl from school named Clara, and Clara looked at Gideon's face when she came in and then looked at Lucy, and Lucy looked back at her with an expression that said clearly, I told you. And Clara squared her small shoulders and said hello, and Gideon said hello back, and that was that. The town was not transformed. It didn't work like that, not in real life. There were still people who crossed the street out of habit, still people whose eyes slid sideways, still the occasional conversation that ended faster than it should. The shape of things changed slowly, the way land changes, not in a moment, but in seasons, in years, in the almost imperceptible accumulation of small adjustments that you can only see by comparing the now to the then. But it was changing. Something in the fabric of Iron Ridge was shifting, thread by thread, in the direction of something more honest than it had been. And at the center of it, without trying to be, without performing anything, was the quiet and unshakable fact of Evelyn Mercer Hawthorne, who had come 9 days by stagecoach to a town full of people who expected her to fail and had simply declined to. What nobody knew yet, not even Evelyn, not quite, was that the real test was still ahead. That all of this, the quiet evenings and the slow thaw and the seed catalogs and Lucy's questions and the small repairs to the fabric of a damaged life, was only the foundation. The thing that would crack the town open completely was still coming. It had a name. It wore expensive boots, and it was very good at making people feel small in public, but that was still ahead. For now, it was early March in Iron Ridge, Wyoming territory, and the ground was beginning to remember what it felt like to be soft. And in a cabin on the edge of town, a man who had stopped expecting good things was very slowly, against his better judgment, starting to hope again. Spring arrived the way it always does in Wyoming. Not gently, not all at once, but in argument with itself. Warm days interrupted by late cold snaps, the ground softening and then freezing again, the sky unable to decide what season it wanted to commit to. By April, the garden plot Evelyn had turned over in the fall was ready, and she spent a Saturday morning on her knees in the dirt, pressing seeds into rows with the focused satisfaction of a person doing something that has a clear and honest outcome. Gideon came out at mid-morning with coffee, set a cup beside her without comment, and crouched down to look at what she'd laid out. "You've got the beans too close to the squash," he said. "I know. I'm going to thin them. The squash will take over everything south of that stake by July." "I know that too. I'm counting on it." She sat back on her heels and looked at the plot. "I want something that spreads." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the garden. "All right," he said, in the tone he used when he was accepting a decision he didn't fully understand but was willing to trust. He took his coffee and went back to the smithy. She watched him go. The blue scarf she'd knitted him was draped over the post inside the smithy door. She'd seen it there every morning for months, close enough to reach when he went to town. He didn't always wear it, but it was always there. Spring also brought more traffic to Iron Ridge. The roads that had been impassable or punishing through the winter opened up, and with them came the seasonal movement of people and goods and commerce that a frontier town ran on. The general store restocked. The livery got busy. New faces appeared on the main street, passing through, and the town had the slightly loosened quality of a fist unclenching after months of cold. It also brought Silas Crow. Evelyn had heard the name before she met the man. You heard it in Iron Ridge the way you heard certain weather, not always directly, but in the way people referenced it. Crow owned the largest cattle operation in the county, somewhere north of town, and the size of his operation had given him the kind of authority that money purchases in places where money is the clearest measure of a man's worth. He was maybe 55, thick through the chest, with the permanent weathered look of a man who'd spent decades outdoors, but had long since stopped doing work with his hands. He came to town maybe once a month, usually with 2 or 3 of his ranch hands trailing him, and when he walked the main street, people stepped back slightly without seeming to, the way water moves around something solid. Gideon had done work for Crow twice, years back. She learned this from Jacob Prentice, who seemed to know the history of every commercial relationship in the county. "Crow paid on time," Jacob said, which was his way of giving the fullest credit he intended to give. But he made sure Gideon knew exactly what he thought of him. Wouldn't talk to him direct. Talk through the ranch hand he'd brought. Like Gideon was, Jacob stopped. Like he wasn't worth addressing. Did Gideon say anything? No, just did the work. She had filed that away the way she'd filed everything, and spring had opened up around her, and she hadn't thought much about Silas Crow for a while. She was busy. The garden was going in. Helen Voss had sent 3 referrals for sewing work. Lucy had started coming on Saturdays as well as the weekday visits, often staying for supper, fitting herself into the rhythm of the household with the adaptability of a child who has learned early to find her place wherever it is available. The afternoon in late April that changed everything started as ordinary as any other. Evelyn had gone to town for thread and a bolt of plain cotton she needed for an apron order. It was a Thursday, mid-afternoon, the main street quiet enough that she could hear the wagon wheels on the dirt clearly, the sound of a door closing 2 buildings down. She came out of the general store with her parcel under one arm and nearly walked into Margaret Birch, and they stood on the boardwalk for a moment doing the small dance of rearranging themselves and said hello. "Your husband just came in," Margaret said, nodding down the street. He brought Perkins's gate pieces. I saw him at the far end. Evelyn looked. She could see Gideon at the south end of the main street, outside Perkins's hardware, unloading something from the back of the wagon. The afternoon light was flat and white, and the street was mostly empty. Then she saw the horses outside the saloon. 4 of them, with a brand she'd seen described but not seen directly before. She started walking. She didn't know yet exactly, but something in her stomach knew. She was maybe 20 feet away, close enough to hear but not close enough to have arrived yet, when it started. Silas Crow came out of the saloon with 2 of his men behind him, moving in that particular way of a man who has been drinking enough to feel large, but not enough to slow him down. He stopped on the boardwalk and looked at Gideon, who was still at the wagon, back turned, lifting the gate hardware. Well, Crow said, loud enough to carry. The freak's out of his hole. Gideon went still. He didn't turn around immediately. The gate piece was still in his hands. Didn't know animals came to town on Thursdays, Crow continued. He was speaking to his men, but speaking for the street. Somebody should have put a sign up. His men laughed, the short obligatory laugh of men who laugh when the boss does. Gideon set the gate piece down. He turned around. He didn't say anything. His jaw was set in the way she'd learned meant he was doing the thing he'd taught himself to do. Containing it, compressing it, making himself take up less space. His right hand had closed at his side, and she could see it from where she stood, that fist, and she understood what it cost to keep it where it was. Crow looked at him with the flat assessment of a man who has decided in advance what he's looking at. His eyes traveled over Gideon's face without flinching. Not because he wasn't disturbed by it, but because disturbing Gideon with his gaze was part of the point. Had a hinge break on the north gate, he said, still in that carrying voice. Was going to bring it in. But looking at you, I think I'd rather have a man do the work. The street was not empty anymore. Evelyn registered it peripherally. A woman who had been sweeping her doorstep had stopped. A man coming out of the feed store had paused. There were maybe 8, 10 people now, all finding reasons to be still, all watching. Gideon's jaw moved once. My work's the same as it's always been. Sure it is, Crow said. Same as a dog can fetch. Doesn't make it a man. He shifted his weight, half turning to his men again. My wife saw you in town last month. Had nightmares for a week. The men laughed again, more comfortably this time, encouraged by the audience. Something happened in Evelyn's chest. Not heat, exactly. It was colder than heat. It was the particular cold of a person who has made a decision before they've consciously caught up to making it. She walked forward. Later, she would not remember deciding to speak. She would remember the cold feeling in her chest, and the sight of Gideon's fist at his side, and the carried sound of Crow's voice. And then she was standing in the street between the wagon and the boardwalk, and she was speaking. Mr. Crow. He turned. He hadn't seen her come up. His eyes adjusted, registering a woman, registering that she was not a woman he recognized immediately, registering her expression, which was not the expression of a woman who had wandered into this accidentally. You know who this man is? She said. She said it to Crow, and she said it to the street, because she had already understood that this conversation was not private. You know the Alcott barn? 6 years ago. A flicker in Crow's face. Not quite recognition, not quite uncertainty. What about it? It burned in the night, she said. You remember that? The Alcotts had animals, horses, mules, goats. The roof was going. Anybody watching from the outside could tell it was going. She looked at Crow steadily. Her voice was not raised. She had learned, from years of Thomas and years of poverty and years of managing things that didn't want to be managed, that you didn't need to raise your voice to be heard. You needed to be the only thing worth listening to. Where were you that night, Mr. Crow? Crow's expression shifted. I don't see what that has to... Most of the men in Iron Ridge were there, she said. I've talked to people who were there. The barn was burning, the animals were trapped, and the men who were there watched the roof and calculated the risk and stayed back. Because that's the sensible thing to do. A burning roof is going to come down. Any reasonable man can see that. She paused. This man went in anyway. He got 3 horses and 2 mules out before the roof started going, and then he went back in for the goats. He came out with the goats. The roof came down 30 seconds after he cleared the door. She let that land. The scars you're looking at right now are what the fire did to him in those last 30 seconds. The street was entirely still. Crow's mouth had closed. The two ranch hands behind him had found somewhere else to look. He didn't do it because it was safe, Evelyn continued. He did it because the animals would have died, and he couldn't stand for that. And he paid for it. Every day since, he's paid for it. Every time someone looks at his face the way you just looked at his face, he pays for it again. She glanced at the ranch hands, at the watching townspeople, at the woman who had stopped sweeping, and the men who stood back that night and watched him do it, the men who made the sensible calculation. They've been collecting the interest on his payment ever since, looking at what he's carrying and calling it something wrong with him. She looked back at Crow. You owe him for a gate hinge, she said. The price is the same as it's always been. The silence lasted long enough to be a sound of its own. Silas Crow looked at her. Then, very slowly, he looked at Gideon. Gideon was watching him with the steady, dark eye, not braced anymore, more like a man who has seen something unexpected and hasn't decided yet what to do with it. The fist at his side had opened. Crow's jaw was tight. He was a man who was rarely at a loss for position, and he was at a loss for it now, and she could see him working out what to do in a situation where the usual tools weren't available. He couldn't bully her the way he'd been bullying Gideon. She'd already seized the ground. He couldn't dismiss her without looking worse than he already did. And in front of 10 people who are all watching with the fixed attention of an audience that has realized the play is something more than expected, walking away was going to cost him something, regardless of which direction he chose. He reached into his jacket and produced a leather wallet. He counted out bills, slightly more than the work had likely cost. Not enough more to be a statement, just enough to close the wound in the least conspicuous way available to him. He held them out. Not to Evelyn, to Gideon. For the hinge worked last fall, he said. His voice was not what it had been 2 minutes ago. It was the voice of a man who has miscalculated and is deciding how to absorb the fact of it. And bring the North Gate piece in when you've got room in your schedule. Gideon took the money. He looked at it once. He looked at Crow. I'll have it done in 2 weeks, he said. Crow nodded, once, tightly. He turned and walked back toward the saloon, his men trailing without the swagger they'd had coming out. The saloon door closed behind them. The street let out its breath. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then one of the men near the feed store, a farmer named DeWitt, whom Evelyn had met once in passing, let out a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else, and shook his head slowly. The woman who had been sweeping looked at Evelyn with an expression that she could only describe as shaken awake. Margaret Birch, who had been standing at the edge of all of it, was looking at Gideon with an expression that was clearly the beginning of a conversation she would need to have with herself. Evelyn turned to Gideon. He was looking at her. She couldn't entirely read his expression. There was too much in it, layered too deep. She thought about asking if he was all right, and then decided that was a question that needed a quieter place than this. Help me get this in the wagon, he said instead, nodding at the remaining gate hardware. All right, she said. They loaded the hardware. They didn't speak. The street had resumed its sounds around them. The sweeping woman had started sweeping again. 2 men near the feed store had gone back to whatever they'd been talking about before. The ordinary texture of a Thursday afternoon in a small town, reestablishing itself over the seam of what had just happened, the way water closes over something dropped into it. When the wagon was loaded and Gideon had climbed up to the seat, he looked at her climbing up beside him and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know." "Where did you learn all of that? The detail about the barn? The 30 seconds? "Jacob Prentice told me. In January." She settled onto the seat. "I've been carrying it around since then." He picked up the reins. His hands were steady. The scarred side of his face caught the afternoon light, and she looked at it the same way she'd looked at it that first day on the main street, without looking away, because she had decided a long time ago that she was going to look at this man fully, or not at all. "You were angry," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "For how long?" "Since January," she said. "Since Jacob told me. Since I understood what the last 6 years actually cost you." She looked ahead at the road. "I wasn't waiting for the right moment. I didn't plan that. I just got there and it was happening, and I was tired of watching it happen." He was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved, the familiar rhythm of wheels on the dirt road. the horse settling into the pace she knew. "What Crow said," he said, "about his wife, the nightmares." "What about it?" "It's not the first time I've heard something like that." He said it flatly, but she could hear the layer under the flat. "Usually I absorb it, find somewhere to put it. And today?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Today I had somewhere else to put it, because you were already putting it somewhere." He glanced at her and then away. "I didn't know what to do with that. I'm still not sure." She didn't answer immediately. The road back to the cabin was short enough that she chose her words carefully, not wanting to say the wrong thing in the time she had. "You don't have to do anything with it," she said finally. "I didn't do it so you'd owe me something. I did it because it needed doing and I was there." She paused. "And because I'm your wife. And that means something. To me it means something." He stopped the wagon in front of the smithy. He sat with the reins in his hands for a moment, not getting down. She waited. "My wife," he said. He said it the same way he'd said her name the first time he'd used it, quietly, carefully, like testing whether the thing was as solid as it appeared to be. "Yes," she said. "Your wife." He looked at her, full on, the way he almost never turned his face toward people. Both sides forward, the scarred and the unscarred, none of the habitual angling away. The afternoon light was still flat and white, and it caught everything, and she looked at him and did not look away. "I don't know what I did," he said, "to get something like this." She thought about several things to say and chose the simplest one. "You told the truth in an advertisement, and I was in the right place to read it." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the closest thing to one she'd heard from him. A short exhale through the nose, something wry and helpless at the same time. He climbed down from the wagon. She climbed down on her side. That evening, something had changed in the quality of his stillness. Not his manner, he was still quiet, still moved around the house in the same considered way. But the bracing was different. The perpetual low-grade preparation for impact that she'd learned to read in the set of his shoulders and the angle of his jaw was not entirely gone, but it was less. Like a man who has been holding a weight for so long he's forgotten he's holding it, and something has just shifted the weight fractionally, and he doesn't know yet what to do with the difference it makes. Lucy came the next morning, Saturday, and found them both in the garden. Evelyn checking on the beans, Gideon adjusting the south fence post that had come slightly loose in the spring thaw. Lucy stood at the garden's edge with her hands on her hips in the supervisory posture she'd developed, apparently assessing the progress. "I heard something happen in town yesterday," she said without preamble. Evelyn looked up. "Where'd you hear that?" "Clara's mother was there. She told Clara. Clara told me." Lucy looked at Gideon. "She said Mrs. Hawthorne said a bunch of stuff, and Mr. Crow had to pay money he owed." Gideon looked at the fence post. "Something like that." "Was it good?" Lucy asked. "What she said?" "Yes," he said. "It was good." Lucy seemed to process this, her dark eyes moving between the two of them. Then she said, in the straightforward way she said most things, "I already knew that. I'm just glad other people found out." She stepped over the garden edge and went to see how the beans were coming, and neither Evelyn nor Gideon said anything, which was the right response. What happened in the days that followed was not a sudden transformation. Evelyn had long since stopped expecting those, in towns or in people. What happened was more like the garden, slow and underground at first, invisible, and then one morning you looked and things had broken the surface that hadn't been there the day before. DeWitt, the farmer from the feed store, came to the smithy 3 days after Thursday with a wagon axle that needed attention. He came himself, not through an intermediary, and he stayed while Gideon worked it, and they talked about the spring planting and the price of grain and the road east, and when he left he shook Gideon's hand. He'd never done that before. Evelyn knew this because Gideon came in for supper and sat down and said, entirely without drama, "DeWitt shook my hand today." And the way he said it, the small, careful weight he gave to the fact, told her exactly how long it had been since something that ordinary had happened to him. Margaret Birch stopped Evelyn on the street the following week and said, without the careful, managed warmth she'd been using for months, something closer to direct. "What you said about the barn, I didn't know. The detail of it. The 30 seconds. She stopped. "I've lived here 12 years. I should have known." "A lot of people should have known a lot of things," Evelyn said. not unkindly. The good news is knowing them now isn't nothing. Margaret nodded. She looked like she was doing something uncomfortable with her conscience and was bearing it, which was all you could reasonably ask. Henry's been meaning to stop in, she said. Not for work, just to stop in. The smithy's always open, Evelyn said. Silas Crow came in 2 weeks, as Gideon had said he would. He brought the north gate piece. He came alone. He didn't say much, not an apology exactly, not anything as shaped as that. What he said, after he'd set the gate piece down and while Gideon was examining it, was, "My father was a ranch hand. He wasn't anybody. He worked hard his whole life and people looked through him." He said it to the forge, not to Gideon. "I used to tell myself I'd never let anyone look through me like that." Gideon looked at him. Crow looked at the forge. The irony of it sat in the room between them like a third person, obvious and unspoken. "I'll have this done in 10 days, Gideon said. "You can pick it up, or I can have it delivered." "I'll pick it up," Crow said. He did. He paid in full, at the price Gideon quoted, without negotiating. He looked at Gideon when he handed the money over. Directly, at the scarred side and the unscarred side both, the way Evelyn had from the beginning. It seemed to cost him something to do it. Gideon looked back. Neither of them made a speech about it. There wasn't a speech to make. But something had shifted in the particular way that things shift between men who have had to recalibrate their understanding of each other, carefully, without ceremony and without any pretense that it didn't take some doing. Evelyn watched this from the kitchen window and thought that sometimes the most significant things in a person's life look, from the outside, like two men exchanging money for a gate hinge. And then she went back to her sewing because the apron order wasn't going to finish itself and she had a delivery to make by Friday. The spring kept going. The garden broke the surface in earnest. First the carrots, then the beans, then the squash beginning its slow campaign to own everything south of the stake, exactly as predicted. Lucy came and recorded its progress with the seriousness of a field researcher. Gideon fixed the south fence post properly this time. Set in new concrete, he'd mixed himself, and stood back and looked at it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who does things right or doesn't do them. Iron Ridge was not a different town, but it was, here and there, in small specific ways that accumulated, a slightly more honest one than it had been in the fall. The woman who had shifted away from Evelyn in the church pew now nodded at her on the street. DeWitt and his wife came to Sunday supper once, a planned thing, not an accident, and sat at the table in the small house and ate and talked, and nobody mentioned scars or fires or advertisements, because none of that was what the evening was about. Gideon sat at the head of his own table, in his own house, with his wife on one side and a neighbor on the other, and if there was something in his face that Evelyn couldn't look at too directly without feeling the weight of all the years it had taken to get to this ordinary table and this ordinary evening, she looked at it anyway. She had always been going to look at it. That was the whole of her answer, if anyone had asked. That was all of it. Summer came to Iron Ridge the way summer always did. Sudden and total, like someone had thrown a switch. The long, slow argument between spring and winter resolved itself overnight, and one morning Evelyn woke to the sound of birds that hadn't been there the day before, and light coming through the bedroom window at an angle that was unmistakably summer light, warm and direct and full of intention. The garden had stopped being a project and started being a fact. The squash had done exactly what Gideon predicted and claimed everything south of the stake, sprawling green and aggressive across the dirt, and the beans were climbing their poles with the focused ambition of things that know what they're supposed to do. Evelyn went out every morning with her coffee and walked the rows, checking progress, pulling the occasional weed, and found that this specific thing, the garden in the early morning before the heat settled in, was the closest she came to a version of peace she hadn't had in years. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter and more reliable than happiness. The sense of being in the right place doing the right thing at the right time, which is rarer than people admit. Gideon had stopped angling his face away. She noticed it first on a Tuesday in June, when they went together to pick up a supply order from the general store. She'd been with him in town before many times, but there was always the subtle geometry of it. The way he positioned himself, the angles he chose, the half-unconscious management of which side of his face the world got to see. That Tuesday, he walked beside her on the main street with his face straight forward, both sides open to the light and to whoever they passed, and she didn't think he knew he was doing it differently. But she noticed, and she didn't say anything, because some things you say and some things you just carry quietly and let be what they are. The town had not become a different place. She needed to be honest with herself about that. There were still people who didn't come to the smithy, still people who had a complicated time meeting Gideon's eyes, still the occasional stranger passing through whose reaction was the old one, the flinch, the look away, the recalibration. That didn't stop. She doubted it ever would stop entirely, not in a place as small as Iron Ridge where the population was what it was, and habits were old. But the texture of it had changed. The quality of the town's attention toward Gideon Hawthorne had shifted from the avoidance of something unwanted to something more nuanced and more honest. The acknowledgement, however imperfect, of a man who had been misjudged and was owed a different kind of looking. People came to the smithy now and stayed. Not always, not everyone, but enough that Gideon had stopped eating his midday meal alone every day. DeWitt came by on Tuesdays to pick up orders and usually found something to talk about for 20 minutes. A younger man named Porter, who'd moved to town in the spring to work at the feed store, had discovered that Gideon would answer questions about metalwork with real precision and had started asking them regularly, sitting on the overturned crate near the door with the focused attention of someone genuinely learning something. Gideon bore this with the particular grace of a man who isn't used to being sought out and hasn't entirely worked out what to do with it. He answered Porter's questions seriously and without condescension. He talked to DeWitt about farming and grain prices and the reliability of certain equipment. He was not suddenly a different person. He was still quiet, still economical with words, still most himself when he was working. But the compression was gone. The careful making himself smaller had stopped, and in its place was just him, which turned out to be a considerable amount. Evelyn watched this and said nothing about it, because he would have found it embarrassing to have the change observed directly. But she watched it and felt the slow warmth of it in her chest, the particular satisfaction of watching something unfold that you had some part in making possible but didn't need credit for. Lucy noticed it too, with the directness she applied to most things. "Mr. Gideon smiled at the Cooper boy today," she announced one Saturday afternoon, coming into the kitchen with the report fresh. "The little one, not the older one. He was scared at first, and then Mr. Gideon said something about the bellows, and the little one forgot to be scared." "What did he say about the bellows?" Evelyn asked. "He said they work like giant lungs. The little Cooper boy thought that was the best thing he'd ever heard." Lucy got herself a cup of water from the bucket and drank it standing up, the way she always did. "It is kind of the best thing I've ever heard." "Gideon's good at explaining things. He's good at lots of things," Lucy said, with the authority of someone stating obvious fact. She set the cup down and leaned against the counter in the posture she'd developed lately. Slightly older than her years, a little deliberate, as if she'd started practicing being the person she was going to be. "My teacher asked me once why I spent so much time at the smithy. Last year, before you came." Evelyn looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said because it was interesting." Lucy paused. "But that wasn't all of it. The real reason was because he always talked to me like what I said mattered, like I wasn't just a kid in the way." She looked at the window. "Most adults don't do that." "No," Evelyn agreed. "They don't. I think that's why he's good with the Cooper boy. He doesn't talk down." Lucy picked up the cup again, realized it was empty, set it back. "He never talked down to me, not once." Evelyn thought about a man who had been talked down to and talked around and talked about for 6 years, and who had somehow managed not to pass that down to the 8-year-old who showed up at his door asking about bellows. She thought about what that took, to be treated a certain way by the world, and refused to become it. "No," she said, "he doesn't do that." The summer moved through its weeks. The smithy stayed busy. Summer was a working season, equipment needing maintenance before harvest, farm machinery that had made it through the winter on patience and luck, and now needed real attention. Gideon worked long days and came in at dusk with the particular tiredness of a man who has spent everything he had and is satisfied with the expenditure. She had supper ready. He washed up. They ate. They talked or didn't, depending on what the day had been, and both kinds of evening had their own worth. One evening in July, he came in and sat down and didn't immediately eat, which was unusual enough that she looked at him.
Alcott came in today, he said. She waited. Martin Alcott, the son. He must be 16 now, 17. He was a kid when the fire happened. Gideon looked at his hands on the table. He came in for a repair on a plow fitting. We did the work, did the transaction, and then when he was leaving, he stopped in the door and said, he stopped. What did he say?
He said, "My father told me what you did the night of the barn." He said, "I've been wanting to say something for a while. I didn't know how." And then he said, "Thank you." Gideon was quiet. That's all. Then he left. Evelyn looked at him across the table. His jaw was working slightly, the way it did when he was holding something that was bigger than the space he usually gave himself for feelings. "That's a long time to carry a thank you," she said finally. 6 years. He picked up his fork, set it back down. I didn't know what to say to him. I said, "You're welcome." And I meant it, but it seemed thin for the thing it was. Maybe it doesn't need to be more than that. Maybe. He was quiet a moment. I've been thinking about it since, about whether I was angry at the Alcotts. I didn't think I was. But then he said thank you and something moved, something I didn't know was still sitting there. She didn't rush to fill the silence. I think I was, he said. Angry. At everyone, maybe. I just buried it so deep that I stopped knowing it was there. It was easier to just close everything off, stop expecting things. He looked up. And then you showed up and started expecting things on my behalf, which I did not ask for and was not prepared for. She almost smiled. I know. I'm not complaining, he said quickly, and then seemed to catch himself. I'm the opposite of complaining. I just didn't know what to do with it at first. You did fine, she said. I mostly stood there while you did things. Standing there was what was needed. You didn't make it harder. That matters more than you think. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know as his version of something deep that he couldn't find the exact words for. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, just set it there, his forge-calloused palm over her knuckles, the way you place something carefully in a spot you've decided is the right one. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while, the supper getting slightly cool on the plates, the summer evening sitting golden in the window, the garden outside doing its quiet work in the long July light. This was what nobody who had watched her arrive off the stagecoach in November had been able to see coming, because it didn't look like anything from the outside. It looked like two people sitting at a table. But it was everything that the whole long winter and the careful spring and the bruising public afternoon in front of the saloon had been building toward. This ordinary moment, this table, this hand in hand, nothing about it was perfect. She knew that. He was still not an easy man, still quiet in ways that sometimes felt like walls, still prone to the old compression when the world pressed on him in certain ways, still sometimes an hour into an evening before he remembered it was all right to take up space. She was not easy either. She was stubborn in ways that occasionally meant she held positions longer than was reasonable. She had a sharp edge that came out when she was tired and sometimes landed wrong. She had spent enough years managing her own survival that sharing the management with another person still felt foreign sometimes, like a language she was fluent in but had learned as an adult rather than being born to it. They had disagreements, not many, but real ones, about money once, about the pace of repairs to the cabin, about Lucy once, in a conversation that was more about exhaustion than its stated subject. They got through them the way you get through things when you've both decided that the getting through matters more than being right, which is not easy, but is possible if both people have actually decided it. What they had built was not a fairy story. It was a marriage, which is a harder and more particular and in the end more valuable thing. August brought the first hint of the harvest's approach, and with it a visit from Jacob Prentice that had more in it than a social call. He came on a Sunday afternoon, which was unusual, and sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the slightly formal demeanor of a man who has organized something to say. Lucy's schoolteacher has been talking to me, he said. Miss Alderman. She thinks Lucy is... She used the word gifted, which I think is the right word, but the point is she's outpacing what the school in Iron Ridge can offer her. There's a school in Cheyenne, a good one, for girls with prospects. He turned his cup in his hands. I don't have the money to send her. The Prentice farm is doing all right, but not that kind of all right. Gideon looked at him. What are you asking, Jacob? Jacob looked back straight on. I'm asking if you'd be willing to be a kind of sponsor. The word they use is patron, which is a fancy word for someone who helps pay for something they believe in. The school has a program. They take girls of real ability who can't afford the tuition outright if someone of standing in the community vouches for them. He paused. I want to vouch for Lucy. I was hoping you'd help with the cost. The kitchen was quiet. Evelyn looked at Gideon. He was looking at Jacob with an expression that was doing something complicated. A man of standing, Gideon said. That's the program's language, Jacob said. Not mine, although... He stopped and then said the thing he'd maybe been building toward. For what it's worth, Gideon, you've been a man of standing in this town longer than most people have been willing to say so. I've always known that. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. What does Lucy want? He asked. She wants to go. She's been trying to play it quiet because she doesn't want to seem like she's... Jacob almost smiled. You know how she is. She doesn't want to be a problem. She's not a problem, Gideon said, with a flatness that had some feeling in it. She's never been a problem. No, Jacob agreed. She's not. Gideon looked at the table. He looked at Evelyn. She gave him nothing with her expression. This was his to decide, and she'd made that clear without words. He turned back to Jacob. How much? He said. Jacob told him. It was not a small amount. It was not an impossible one. I'll need to work it out over 2 seasons, Gideon said. But yes. Yes, I'll do it. Jacob let out a breath that told Evelyn he'd been more uncertain about this conversation than he'd appeared. I'll tell Miss Alderman. Tell Lucy first, Gideon said. She should hear it before anyone else does. Lucy came the next day, a Monday, which wasn't her usual day. She came directly to the smithy, bypassing the kitchen, which meant she already knew. Evelyn heard them through the open smithy window. Not the words, just the cadence of voices, and then a silence, and then a sound that was not Lucy's usual composure, high and quick and caught. The sound of a child who has been practicing not to cry and has stopped practicing for a moment. Then Gideon's voice, lower, and then quiet again. Lucy came into the kitchen 20 minutes later with red eyes and her chin up, which was the most Lucy thing Evelyn had ever seen her do. She sat down at the table and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at Evelyn with the expression of someone who has decided to be straightforward about something emotional, which takes more courage than people give it credit for. He said it wasn't a favor, Lucy said. He said it was an investment. He said he expected me to do something worth it. She paused. I told him I would. I meant it. I know you meant it, Evelyn said. I'm going to come back, Lucy said, with a slight fierceness that Evelyn understood was about more than just geography. People who go away don't always come back. I'm going to. I know that too. Lucy looked at her hands on the table. Why did he do it? She said quietly. I know why. He told me why. She stopped. He's been alone for so long, and he did something that big. For me. Evelyn thought about what to say and chose the most honest version. Because you saw him, she said. When you were 8 years old and you didn't know any better, you walked into that smithy and you saw a person worth seeing, and he's never forgotten that. She paused. People remember being seen. It doesn't leave them. Lucy was quiet. She nodded once, slowly, the way she nodded when she was actually taking something in rather than just receiving it. Okay, she said. Then, the squash is going to take over the whole south end of the garden by September. I know, Evelyn said. That was the plan. That's a lot of squash. We'll manage. Lucy stayed for supper, the way she often did. And the evening was ordinary in all the ways that ordinary evenings had become precious. The food, the table, the lamp, the conversation that moved around through practical things and silly things and the occasional thing of weight, the way real conversation does. Gideon told a story about a mule he'd shoed that morning that had opinions about the process, and Lucy laughed the real laugh she had, not the polite one, and Evelyn laughed too. And the sound of it moved through the small house and into the summer evening outside, where the garden was doing its work in the dark, and the town of Iron Ridge was settling into another night, changed in small but permanent ways from what it had been a year ago. After Lucy had gone home and the supper things were cleared, Gideon stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark yard, and Evelyn came and stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. He didn't move away. "Do you think she'll come back?" he said. "After Cheyenne?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "I think she'll come back and she'll be something this town didn't expect. And it'll be good for the town whether the town deserves it or not." He considered this. "She's going to do something," he said. "I don't know what, but something." "She is," Evelyn agreed. Outside the window, the summer night was full of sound. Insects, the distant sound of something moving in the field, the ordinary music of a warm evening in a place where things were growing. The squash was invisible in the dark, but it was out there, doing what it did, expanding toward whatever space was available. Gideon put his arm around his wife's shoulders, carefully, the way he did everything, with the weight of a man who doesn't take things for granted because he knows, in his bones, what it costs when they're gone. She leaned into it. They stood at the window and looked out at the dark garden and the dark town beyond it, and neither of them said anything, because what was there to say? The year had done its work. The ground had been turned and the seeds had gone in, and some of them had grown into things worth keeping, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was, in fact, everything. Lucy left for Cheyenne on a Thursday morning in late August, with a trunk that Evelyn had helped her pack and a coat that finally fit her properly. Evelyn had let out the seams of the old one and reinforced the collar, and it looked almost new, which was close enough. Jacob Prentice drove her to the stage stop. Gideon and Evelyn came to see her off, along with Clara and Clara's mother and Miss Alderman, the schoolteacher, who had the satisfied expression of a person watching the right outcome of something they'd worked toward. Lucy hugged Clara, shook Miss Alderman's hand with a formality that made the teacher smile, hugged Jacob Prentice around the middle in the way of someone who has been grateful to a person for a long time and is finally letting it show. Then she came to Gideon and Evelyn. She hugged Evelyn first, hard and quick, the way Lucy did everything. Fully committed, no half measures. Then she stepped back and looked at Gideon, and he looked at her, and for a moment they just stood there. The big scarred blacksmith and the small dark-haired girl who had walked into his smithy 4 years ago with questions about bellows and had never really stopped. "You're going to be fine," he said. "I know," she said. "Right when you get there." "I will." He put his hand on the top of her head, once, briefly. The gesture of a man who isn't comfortable with sentiment and has found its exact minimum viable expression. She didn't make a thing of it. She picked up her bag and climbed into the stage, and the stage left, and Lucy was gone, off into the part of her life that Iron Ridge had been too small to contain. Evelyn stood beside Gideon and watched the stage diminish down the road, and neither of them said anything for a while. The August morning was already warm. The town was starting its day around them, the ordinary sounds of it, and eventually they walked back to the wagon and drove home. And the house was quieter than usual that day, which was expected and had to be gotten through regardless. "She's going to be all right," Evelyn said at supper. "I know she is," Gideon said. He said it with the certainty of a man who has decided something, rather than the certainty of a man who is merely hoping. "She was going to be all right from the first time she walked in and asked me what temperature the fire had to be." He ate for a moment. "I just didn't know I was going to get to see it." That was the thing about loss of the good kind. See, the kind where someone leaves not because something went wrong, but because something went right. It still emptied a space. The kitchen felt it on Saturdays, the smithy felt it on the days she'd usually come. But the space wasn't the hollow kind. It had something in it, the shape of what had been there, which is different from nothing. They adjusted. They were good at adjusting by now. It was one of the things the year had taught them. The seasons turned. The harvest came in. The squash abundant beyond any reasonable requirement. The beans good. The carrots exactly what Gideon had predicted, deep and sweet. Evelyn put up preserves for the first time in her life, learning the process from Helen Voss in an afternoon that involved more boiling water than she'd expected, and one jar that didn't seal properly and had to be used immediately, which meant a week of squash and everything. Gideon ate it without complaint. She was fairly certain he actually liked it, which she chose not to examine too closely because it would have made her feel smug. The second winter was easier than the first. Not because the cold was any different. Wyoming cold doesn't moderate itself on your behalf. But because they knew it now, knew the rhythms of the house in cold weather, knew where the draft came in and how to manage it, knew how to be two people in a small space through the long months without wearing on each other more than necessary. They had found the particular calibration of closeness and space that a marriage needs, and that you can't calculate in advance. You can only discover it by living inside it long enough to know where the edges are. That second winter was also when Gideon started talking about the fire. Not all at once, not in a planned way. In the incremental way of someone who has kept something stored in the dark for so long that bringing it toward the light has to happen gradually or it collapses. He'd mention a detail, something about the way the smoke moved, something about the sound, something about the quality of the dark inside a burning building that is different from any other dark. He didn't present these as confessions. They came out the way things come out between people who have been paying enough attention to each other that the unsaid things find their own moments. One evening in January, the second January, the one that felt different from the first, he said, without particular preamble, "I went back in the second time because I could hear the goats." She looked up from her sewing. "That's all it was," he said. "Not heroism, not any kind of decision. I could hear them, and I couldn't stand the hearing them, so I went back." He looked at the stove. "Afterward, people called it brave. I never knew what to do with that. It didn't feel like bravery. It felt like I didn't have a choice." "Maybe that's what bravery is," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "Maybe bravery isn't when you decide to do the hard thing," she said. "Maybe it's when you can't make yourself not do it, when the alternative is unlivable." She set her sewing down. "That sounds more like you than any other definition." He was quiet for a long time. "I spent 6 years wishing I hadn't gone back in," he said. "Not because the animals weren't worth it, because I thought the cost was—" He stopped. "I thought the cost was more than I could ever get back. And now?" He looked at her across the room, this woman who had come 9 days by stagecoach to marry a man she'd never met because he'd told the truth in an advertisement, and who had stood in the street and said the things that needed saying, and who had stayed, who had simply, stubbornly, continued to stay. "Now I think the cost got me here," he said, "which is not a comfortable thing to think, but it's what I think." She picked her sewing back up. "It's not comfortable," she agreed, "but I'll take it." He almost smiled. The almost smile had become, over the course of a year and a half, something she could read clearly. The slight shift at the undamaged corner of his mouth, the change in his right eye. It was one of the things she knew about him that nobody else did, and she kept it carefully, the way you keep the things that belong to you. Lucy's first letter arrived in September, her second in November. By the second winter, they were arriving monthly, dense with detail. The school, the other girls, the teachers, the city, the particular texture of a life being expanded rapidly in all directions by someone who has the capacity for it and has finally been given the room. She was doing well. She was doing better than well. Miss Alderman had been right about the word gifted, which was not a small word, and Lucy was living up to it without apparent effort, which was the mark of someone who has finally found the environment that fits what they actually are. She wrote to Gideon separately from her letters to Evelyn. Evelyn knew this not because she read them, she didn't, but because occasionally Gideon would mention something Lucy had said, and it was something Evelyn's own letter hadn't contained. He kept his letters in the small box on the shelf in the back room, the one that held the few things he kept. She didn't know exactly what Lucy wrote to him, and she didn't need to. Some things between people are theirs alone, and the fact that a young girl who was going to be something remarkable kept writing separately to the scarred blacksmith who had believed in her enough to put his money behind the belief, that was theirs. It was good, and it was theirs. 3 years passed. This is the part of any story where time moves differently. Not because less happens, but because what happens is the accumulation of ordinary things that don't announce themselves individually, but add up to something unmistakable when you look back at the distance traveled. The garden expanded. The cabin got a new roof. Gideon did most of it himself, with DeWitt's help one Saturday, and Evelyn fed them and watched and pointed out the section near the east chimney that still didn't look right, which Gideon said was fine, and which turned out the following spring not to have been fine, a fact that she declined to make much of. The smithy took on more work than Gideon could comfortably manage alone, and he hired a young man named Cal Marsh to apprentice, which meant the smithy had 2 voices in it now, and the sounds coming through the kitchen window were different, more varied, occasionally featuring an argument about technique that Evelyn could hear without being able to make out the words. Iron Ridge changed the way all small towns change, slowly, in ways you notice only in comparison.
New families came. One old family left. The schoolhouse got a second room. A doctor arrived who was younger than the previous one and had ideas about sanitation that made the older residents skeptical and the younger ones hopeful. The main street got 2 new buildings. And somewhere in the texture of all this ordinary change, Gideon Hawthorne had become, without campaign, without announcement, without any effort toward it, one of the town's fixed points. Not beloved exactly, not in the sentimental way of stories, more like respected in the way of something that has been tested and held. People came to him not just for metalwork, but for the steadiness of him, the way you seek out the person in any community who you know will tell you the truth about a thing without dressing it up. He had always been that person, even in the years when the town had been too busy looking at his face to notice. Now they noticed. Silas Crow, remarkably, had become something like a reliable customer and something distantly approaching an acquaintance. Not a friend. Gideon didn't have the kind of feelings about Crow that the word friend requires, and Crow was not a man who invited friendship easily. But there was a thing between them now that was more honest than what had existed before the afternoon in front of the saloon. Crow brought his work to the smithy and paid a fair price and spoke directly to Gideon when he did. And once, only once, and Gideon told Evelyn about it with the flat tone he used for things that had moved him more than he wanted to show. Crow had said, "You do the best ironwork in the county. Should have said so years ago." He hadn't elaborated. He hadn't apologized. But he'd said it, and Gideon had accepted it for what it was, which was a man doing the limited version of the right thing that he was capable of, which is sometimes all you get and is still worth something. Lucy came home in the spring of the 4th year. Not permanently. She had a second year of schooling still ahead of her, and after that she had plans that were still forming but were clearly going to take her beyond Iron Ridge for a long while. She came home for 2 weeks in May, and those 2 weeks were a thing. She was 17 now, and she was not the same girl who had left, which was the entire point of sending her, but it still required an adjustment to encounter. She was taller. She carried herself differently, not with the confidence that comes from having been told you're special, but with the quieter confidence of someone who has been given difficult things to do and has done them. She still had the directness, the dark eyes that took inventory, the grit. Those things were irreducible, but they had been refined the way iron gets refined. The essential quality concentrated and clarified by the process. She spent most of her time at the smithy or at the cabin, which was where she'd always spent her time. She and Gideon picked up the thread of their particular conversation as if it had only been briefly paused, which in some sense it had, because Lucy's letters had kept it running even across the distance. One afternoon, Evelyn came out to the garden and found them both there. Gideon pulling the fence stake that had been slowly listing south all spring. Lucy crouched beside the squash beds, doing the ruthless thinning that the plants required if you wanted them to produce instead of just sprawl. "You still have too much squash," Lucy said without looking up. "We always have too much squash," Evelyn said. "It's a feature." "A feature," Lucy repeated skeptically. She pulled a runner that had exceeded its mandate and held it up. "This one was trying to reach the fence." "They all try to reach the fence." Lucy dropped the runner and looked at the garden with the comprehensive assessment that Evelyn recognized as something the girl had always had, but that the school had sharpened into something more directed. "You've added the beds on the north side." "Last fall." "What's going in there?" "Herbs. And one experimental bed of something I read about in a catalog that may or may not work in this soil." "That's very you," Lucy said, and it was a compliment, which was very Lucy. Gideon set the fence stake and tamped it down and stood back and looked at it, checking the level with his eye. "Straight," he said to himself. "Slightly left," Lucy said. He looked at her. Then he looked at the stake. He adjusted it. He stood back. "Straight," he said again. "Better," Lucy agreed. Evelyn looked at the two of them, the big quiet man and the girl who had grown into herself, and felt the full complicated weight of the last 4 years settle through her. Not with sadness, with something more like the feeling you get at the end of a long piece of work, when you step back and look at what has been built and understand that it is real, that it exists independently of whether you keep watching it, that it will stand on its own. That evening, the 3 of them sat on the porch after supper, a thing they'd started doing when the weather allowed, the Wyoming evenings being long and warm in May and worth sitting in.
The light came horizontal through the trees at the edge of the property and turned everything gold for about 20 minutes before it dropped. And in that 20 minutes, the world looked like something someone had deliberately made beautiful. Lucy was talking about a girl at school she'd been corresponding with, someone from a family in a different county, someone sharp and funny and worth knowing. And Gideon was listening with the attention he gave things that actually mattered to him. And Evelyn was listening too, and the porch held all three of them in the gold evening light. And it was one of those moments that you don't know to hold on to at the time, because it looks like any other moment, except that afterward you remember it with the precise clarity of something the mind has decided to keep. Later, after Lucy had gone to bed in the small room that had become hers, without anyone making a formal declaration about it, Gideon and Evelyn sat alone on the porch in the dark. He said, after a while, "I used to think every day would be the day you'd figure out you'd made a mistake." She'd heard this from him before, in different shapes, at different times. She understood that it wasn't a question requiring reassurance anymore. It was more like a man reporting the record of his own thinking so that it could be witnessed and therefore gradually become less powerful. "I know you did," she said. "I know it's not true now," he said. I'm not telling you because I need you to say something about it. I'm telling you because I noticed the difference between then and now." He was quiet for a moment. "It took longer than it should have." "It took exactly as long as it took," she said. "That's how these things work. You're very reasonable about things that are actually difficult." "I'm reasonable about them on the outside," she said. "On the inside, I'm considerably more complicated." He made the almost laugh sound. She could hear the smile in it even without seeing it in the dark. "Evelyn," he said, "the only lie I ever really believed." He stopped, started again. "I believed for a long time that I wasn't, that there wasn't anything in me worth—" He was having trouble with it, which was not unusual for him with the deep things. She waited. "I believed I was only worth what I could make, what I could produce, not anything else." The dark porch held them. The May night was soft around the edges. "I know you believed that," she said. "I don't anymore," he said. "That's what I'm trying to say. I don't believe it anymore." He paused. "I don't know exactly when it changed. I don't think it was one moment. I think it was just—" He looked out at the dark garden, the dark yard, the dark town beyond. "I think it was just you. Staying, and then Lucy staying in her way. And then other people staying in their smaller ways, until I ran out of reasons to keep believing the other thing." She reached over and found his hand in the dark. He took it. "The other thing was never true," she said. "For what it's worth, from someone who came a long way to find out." "It's worth a lot," he said. "It's worth everything." They sat in the dark on the porch of the house that had once been just his and was now theirs in every sense that mattered. And the night settled around them, and the garden was out there doing its growing in the dark. And the town of Iron Ridge was doing what towns do, which is simply continuing, carrying its stories forward without always knowing what they mean. Lucy went back to school in June and came back the following spring with her schooling finished and plans that exceeded what Iron Ridge could contain. She moved to Cheyenne, then further east, and she did the thing that Gideon had known she would do without knowing exactly what it would be. She became a teacher herself, not in a small school, but in an institution that trained other teachers, which meant the particular gift she had for seeing people clearly and refusing to talk down to them multiplied outward through every student she ever taught. She married at 23 a quiet man named Thomas Arden, who was a surveyor and had the patient temperament of someone who spends his days measuring things accurately. She wrote to Gideon and Evelyn about him at length before she brought him home to meet them, which he had the sense to understand was significant. When their first son was born, she wrote the news in a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning. Evelyn read it first, then handed it to Gideon across the breakfast table without comment. He read it. He read it again. The boy's name was Gideon Arden. He set the letter down on the table with the particular care of a man handling something he doesn't want to damage. He looked at it for a long moment. Evelyn looked at him. There were no words for the thing on his face, which was not a simple thing. It was the accumulated weight of every year of being invisible, and the slow, difficult work of becoming visible again, and the unexpected arrival, at the end of all that, of this, a child named after him by a girl who had seen him clearly when almost no one else would. He didn't say anything, There wasn't anything adequate to say. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the way she had that summer evening that felt like a very long time ago now, and he turned his hand over and held hers, the way he had then. Some things don't need language. Some things are bigger than language, and you honor them by not trying to reduce them to it.
The years went on. They always do. Gideon's hair went fully gray, and then the gray had white in it. Evelyn's hands knew the work of the garden as well as they knew anything, better than they knew sewing, eventually, which was saying something. The cabin got 2 additions over the years, built slowly, done right, the way Gideon did everything. The smithy passed eventually to Cal Marsh, who had grown from apprentice to craftsman to partner over the span of a decade, and Gideon stepped back from it gradually, the way you step back from anything that has been the center of your life. Not letting go exactly, but loosening your grip enough to let it belong to someone else's future.
Iron Ridge grew. The things that small towns lose and the things they keep are not always the things you'd choose, and Iron Ridge was no different. Some of what was best about it in those years got diluted as it expanded. But the story of the scarred blacksmith and the woman who came 9 days by stagecoach to marry him stayed in the fabric of the place, passed along in the way that the stories people decide to keep always get passed along. Not as legend, not as sermon, but as the kind of thing someone tells a younger person when they need to hear that it's possible to be seen accurately by at least one other person in the world, and that sometimes that is enough to change everything. What nobody said but what was true was that the story wasn't about the scars. It was never about the scars. The scars were just the thing that made everyone look in the wrong direction for long enough that they missed the actual story, which was about what it costs to be honest in an advertisement when the world has taught you that honesty about your worst parts earns you nothing, and what it means when someone reads that honesty and comes anyway and stays. Evelyn Mercer had been 35 years old and broke and tired when she read a letter from a blacksmith in Wyoming Territory and recognized in it the thing she'd been missing, which was the truth, stated plainly, without ornamentation. She had come 9 days by stage to a town full of people who were certain she would fail. She had not failed. She had done something that looked from the outside like a series of small, ordinary things: cooking supper, planting a garden, standing in a street one April afternoon and saying what needed saying. But that added up over the years to a life. A real one. The kind that doesn't look like much in any given moment, but that, when you step back and look at the whole of it, turns out to have been everything. And Gideon Hawthorne, the scarred blacksmith of Iron Ridge, who had written an honest advertisement and braced himself for silence, and received instead this woman, this impossible, stubborn, clear-eyed woman, spent the rest of his life being surprised by his own life. Not because it was perfect. It wasn't perfect. He was not a perfect man, and she was not a perfect woman. And Iron Ridge was not a perfect town. And the world is not a perfect place, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But it was real, and it was his. And that turned out to be more than he had ever believed he deserved, and exactly what he had always needed. And the difference between those two things, between what we believe we deserve and what we actually need, is where most of the important stories live. This was one of them.